So we'll go into the summary and look a little bit closer at the text as a whole. We found during the reading of the fourth session that Derrida is deconstruction the tendencies within Jacob, and that Jacob, in the effort to get rid of vitalism, the idea of life as an essence, actually reinvents another essence. And that's the essence of reproduction, which is pure, clear, or archetypal. This becomes the foundation, and it needs reality, véritablement. This is why it's so important with this absolute transference from the original through a mechanism. I depicted this with sort of equations, numerals, and also cogs that sort of produces from the original, turning the cogs and leading to a proper copy, so that this unmentioned essence of reproduction, which is life according to Jacob, it is like letters of a text we saw from page 80. The text transfers itself. It is a transferal machinery that gives an offspring. There are many analogies here. I looked earlier on page 80. He has deciphering program, writing, reading, code, copies, etc. There's also an analogy of a computer and analogy of a factory. And he often uses words like faithfulness, strictness, rigor. And then we come into the program. Program has also a decisive role to play in Jacob's texts. The program is once more something that gives associations to this definiteness, the absoluteness. This life, this absolute fixation with the machinery, is a meta-order. we have the two conceptual threads we mentioned from page 82. He says that the computer, or better, a chemical factory, and the text are analogous models. Is that true, or are they actually participating? They do reproduction, they copy, they duplicate. And then, for example, Jacob refers to these as the very essence of living. Derrida discovered Jacob, so to speak, and how he brings in a super-vitalism. Only the living, and it is by this that one recognizes the living, has the power to reproduce itself. And Jacob wants to make this reproduce itself to be self-evident, simple, easy to understand. But it's far from it. Fission is a sort of reproductive detail. We also saw that some viruses are helping the bacterium to reproduce and enters into that genetic material. But he still writes, and this is on Jacob, page 83, last paragraph, and yet biology has demonstrated that there is no metaphysical entity hidden by the word life. So what he thinks is down to earth is what he is defending. The power of assembling, of producing, increasing complex structures, even of reproducing oneself, belongs to the elements that constitute matter. It's a vitalism that points its finger to matters. What Jacob managed to do is to make life even more of a metaphysical thing than ever. And he needs to defend that view, using the analogies over and over again. And then also adding true many, many times. Listen to this. It is not within the power of any single molecule by itself to reproduce itself. He really tries to put his foot down. And he institutes the aimlessness, trying to defend his metaphysical position. Here he is directly referring to Newtonism, to found his ideas, that the sheer aimlessness will help in the deception, so to speak, of his essence. It's a bit like he's saying, oh, I can do this essence since I have a carte blanche from Newtonianism. Look, it is aimless. And here from page 86 we have an interesting that even the psyche is a sort of a reproduction of the self. It's an intrinsic property also made by machinery. It's almost here like Jacob is predicting what is to come with future philosophy, where psyche, consciousness disappears from view. And as we go through the pages, it becomes clearer and clearer the essentialism that Jacob is inferring. The essence of life gets more and more established, and it's so very different from dead matter. It has an essence of energia, and often used by Jacob is the trope of energy to explain reproduction. Free energy, bound energy, binding energy, tendency towards binding, and a decrease of free energy. And page 88, he seems to be saying in a traditional life that life is the essence, the capacity to reproduce oneself from the inside, the intrinsic property. It's also important. It is not coming from the observer, the environment. And he established an essentialism that beats the Hegelian essentialism. They're all association here: dynamis, energia, Spinoza's conatus, and Leibniz appetitus. There is a very interesting part here when he compares Freud, who has the same want to get rid of essentialism, but therefore reinforcing it strongly, I would say. For Freud, human beings are aimless, determined, but he makes that in itself an essence. The aimlessness, the lack of conscious control, is the essence in Freud. Oddly, in some instances, close to Jacob's position. I really like the idea here. One observes the recopying with extreme rigor of a program which prescribes not only detailed plane of each molecular structure, but the means of executing the plan and of coordinating the activities of the structures. Here we have such a machine. It's called a copying machine. And I think that is where a lot of his association come very close. But oddly enough, it is not true. We saw yesterday a little video clip by Jim Al-Khalili. All processes, even that of a copying machine like this one, Xerox, are linear, non-linear. They will take out small differences. They will duplicate, magnify, and the result will be different. The absolute copy is rather a thing that is needed for him to keep his essence. To have his meta-thinking. Maybe it comes from my colleague here.
I don't really want to go out, so that really is a supplement. But it gives sometimes a nice touch to the language. Do we need supplements? Both yes and no. Like in the phrase, I don't really want to go out. It gives a emphasis. That is also a supplement. In this paper, the supplement is death and sexuality. And Jacob wants to push out, eliminate pleasure, that is sexuality, that is something extra, you don't really need it. You should, the ideal thing is like the copy machine that you mentioned. We need more copy machines. Human beings should be like copy machines. Copy themselves identically, produce identical offspring. That's the idea of Jacob and Monod. Now, true life is not like that. I could return to the paper that we went through yesterday, 1563, by Richard Jorgensen, and reread this important phrase from page 3, the very last sentence. Biological evolution fundamentally depends on the existence and nature of genetic variations. So we need variation, and that's the spice of life, like literal spice in food. So long live Derrida, and that's my take. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. See, I'm gonna zoom in what my little drawing here. See if it can become a little clearer here. The idea of a machinery that doesn't exist. And I think it was so good of Jim Al-Khalili to point out that it is all non-linear. Even the copying machine, and he used in this a video, as we're using here now, a video that feeds back to video, to feeds back to video. One would think with a digital video that no deviances would be possible. That's the absolute, only ones and zeros. But lo and behold, differences surely evolves, and they are unpredictable from the beginning. With a true copy, it doesn't even make sense. And of course, Jacob, Monod and Dawkins will have everything explicit. The idea that only the things that are out to be read. So their idea of the text is extremely limited. It is a limiting tendency. I would call they are employees of Limited Incorporated. Fantastic book by Derrida as well, where he shows that John Searle is one of these essentialists that constantly strive to make things more and more determinate. That will lead to fixation. So welcome back after the summary here. I will now continue the oddly enough first session, programs. And this is of course from Life, Death by Jacques Derrida. And this is the very first page in the English edition, in the French as well. What did I do when I announced this seminar under the title Life, Death? That is, when I replaced with a hyphen or a space without a mark, or a mark without a word, with a marked silence, the and that generally posits death with life. The one juxtaposed with the other, or more surely opposed to the other. It is perhaps just such a relationship of juxtaposition or opposition, such a relationship of position, such a logic of position that will come into question when it comes to life, death. By doing away with the and, I was trying to intimate not that life did not form two, or that the one was not the other of the other. But that this alterity or this difference was not of the order of what philosophy calls opposition. The double positioning of two facing one another in the sense in which, for example, in Hegel, the concept of position and the position of the concept, self-positioning and opposition, are the driving schemas of the dialectic. A dialectic that essentially moves forward or puts itself forward as a very powerful thinking of life and death, of the relations, as one says, between life and death. And especially where the opposition, the contradiction, dialectical or not, is the process by which one opposite passes into the other. The process of identification, whereby the one is sublated into the other. If you were to follow the great syllogism of life at the end of Hegel's Science of Logic, you would see how life, which is essentially a position, of the idea that posits itself through its three oppositions, namely the living individual, the life process, and the genus. Reappropriates itself as life through the opposition with death, and is born as life of the spirit in natural death, following a movement that is everywhere marked in Hegel. And to which we will naturally have to return. By simply alluding to it in this way, in order to begin, I wish to note three things. First of all, the and of juxtaposition or of opposition must be questioned and thus suspended long enough to ask not only whether the relationships between being and death really are a matter of what is called opposition or contradiction, but also more radically whether what we think we understand by the concept of position, opposition, or juxtaposition, or even contradiction, was not constructed by a logic of life, death, that would itself be conceived. But what interests in this in view, that is the question beneath a positional schema, as if the entire logic of opposition were a ruse put forward by life-death. In order to conceal, protect, shelter, harbor, or forget something. But what? At what in any event that is no longer either posited or opposed, and that would no longer be something in this sense of position. At what in any event that is no longer either posited or opposed, and that would no longer be something in this sense of position. So what if life and death are not in position towards or against or together with each other? You will surely find that I am beginning a course on life and death in a rather abstract manner. What is more concrete than life-death, you will say? But what is more abstract as well? Is there a greater or another power of abstraction? By insisting on the necessity of beginning with questions of this type, questions of a logical type, if you will, by asking whether the entire positional and oppositional logic in which we have thought and continue to think the limit, the slash life death, is not only not powerful enough to think this limit, but is itself produced as an effect of life-death. And so must be reread as a logic in general from this point of view. I'm indicating two textual markers that today seem to me indispensable. On the one hand, Hegel, especially Hegel's logic, which says at the beginning of the chapter Life, that the idea of life is concerned with a subject matter so concrete and, if you will, so real that with it we may seem to have overstepped the domain of logic as it is commonly conceived. Now the whole demonstration that follows tends, on the contrary, against this received view. To make of life, the idea of life, the living being, the life process, the reproduction of the species, something that not only has to do with logic, but also defines our access to knowledge. On the other hand, another textual marker what I will call the logic of the living, to use the title of Jacob's book, tends today through the whole problematic of the message, the code, indeed the genetic text, to decode the living. Le vivant, not life, say these biologists, because of the skepticism regarding what they believe a bit too quickly to be hypostasizing and substantialist compulsion of the philosopher, though they fail to mention, for example, that Hegel demonstrated the necessity of going by way of the living. As a necessary position within the syllogism of life, that is the judgment, Urteil of life, that originally divides in order to produce itself and reproduce itself. And modernity then, that tends to decipher the living as a language that itself partakes of a logic. We will restrict ourselves here to the field marked out between these two textual indicators in order to locate just a few points of reference. So, life is more than not being deaf. By opposing life to death, we reduce it. And Derrida's point here, it's not abstract, what he's saying. Maybe the normal way of seeing these things is a sort of an abstraction, where we use death as marker of life, although we don't know if they have anything in common. Two, I also wanted to underscore with this first reference to Hegel and to the logic of opposition that it is not a question for me of one opposing another logic to this logic of opposition, life and death. It goes without saying that if somewhere, when it comes to life-death, the logic of opposition itself, is lacking in pertinence, the other logic to which we will then have recourse will not be the other in Hegelian sense. That is to say, it will not be its opposed other. It will not be another logic that has as its relationship of opposition with the logic of opposition. So logic is not enough to describe these things. It is an awful essentialist reduction of what goes on. There's more to life than being the opposite of death, and so is death. It will therefore be a question of an other alterity, in which the other is qualifying alterity, the other alterity would no longer have anything to do with the alterity it would come to alter. But in saying life-death in order to approach this other alterity, it is also not a question for me of two, trying to identify life and death, to say life is death. A proposition, as you know, can be supported in multiple ways, through numerous, well-known paths. The blank between life and death does not come in place of an and or an is. In Hegelian dialectical logic, the is of judgment here comes as the place of contradiction and of its Aufhebung. To declare that life is death, that life is posited in its syllogism through the mediation of death, That is, in the dynamic, productive sense of the word is. The process of death, at the end of which is itself becomes life. The being of the is becomes life, once again in dissymmetry that I try to analyze elsewhere. I'm going to put a pause there. So, as a summary here, this is difficult. Derrida goes in, he is not antagonizing, he's not criticizing, but he's looking into oppositions themselves. And it's interesting to note that the origin comes from andi, means in front of, towards something. And it shows that against or opposition has a spatial reality to it, dividing space in two parts. If Derrida is questioning something, is that division, does it really make sure that there is a relation, that is the genetical heredity between life and death and other so-called oppositions? There are languages that don't use oppositions at all in a spatial sense and don't have them. Some languages, as the Indian system of Veda, has 3 positions. None of them are not, and none of them are is. So it's a special Western trait, which I think has been disapproved by quantum mechanics, that makes use of complementarity, which is not truly splitting of the space. It's including space in a vortex, a movement. Edward de Bono put great effort in his magnum opus, I'm right, you're wrong, how to break the black and white thinking. He would have met upon Derrida and learned a lot more about this, I would say, undiscovered until Derrida. In some sense also Heidegger, Wittgenstein, problematic thing in our perception. Let me read this from page 3, last paragraph. Opposing another logic to this logic of opposition, life/death, it goes without saying that if somewhere the logic of opposition itself is lacking in pertinence, in the other logic to which we will then have to recourse will not be the other in an Hegelian sense. That is to say, it will not be its opposed other, its andi. It will not be another logic that has a relationship of opposition with the logic of opposition. oppositions is an unquestioned remains from antiquity. It is particularly Western, and we know it to be not very effective. None of the scientific discoveries or inventions are used by opposition. Exactly zero. We would not have a development if we trusted opposition. That doesn't mean it cannot be useful in limited sense in ordinary language. I think it has a use. By hypostasizing oppositions and making them essences, we come into problem. And this is what Derrida says in the beginning, is defending himself for being abstract by saying that the ordinary use, the Western use of life-death, is in itself extremely abstract, even a bit deceitful, so to speak. Why on earth would life have anything to do with death? Watanabe, the Japanese philosopher, he was horrified by this oversimplified, almost infantile conclusion, often in Western thinking. You might as well put life next to summer and say they are opposites. Or why not water? What oppositions do is leave out things. They put everything into parentheses or into the darkness. When we say life is in opposition to death, we will lose both the knowledge of life and death by putting an arbitrary thing like death next to it. The same we looked into science of the physicos of the Ionian tradition, who put non-existence next to existence, or created non-existence. Thereby severely limiting understanding and progress. Heraclitus took good use of that. He used summer and winter, night and day. Take everything out of a day. Will you receive night? No. Why would you? It's an arbitrary chosen word, only in Greek language, that so suffused our thinking. Take everything out of summer and you get winter. Take everything out of water and you get dry land. We are ruled by this, but the consequences are random. The opening session was more difficult than the fourth and the fifth, I would say. Fourth page, trying to identify life and death, to say life is death. A proposition, as you know, can be supported in multiple ways through numerous well-known paths. The blank between life and death does not come in place of an and or an is. It's a way of getting away from the disruption of space. In Hegelian dialectical logic, the is of judgment here comes as the place of contradiction and of its Aufhebung, to declare that life is death. So the unlawful work of a syllogism is at place, placed of an unthinking division of space, and I would say time also. Maybe a comment from my colleague here.
Mm-hmm. So, what is life for Jacob? It is a capacity of reproducing exact copies of oneself. That's the highest form of life for Jacob. He eliminates death and sexuality and pleasure. They are like extras. About 1 week ago, I presented this text from Revelation chapter 3, verse 7, and it says that Jesus is speaking. He is the Holy One, the truthful one, he who has the key of David. That's what we read in most manuscripts. But in some manuscripts, instead of David, you have the word Hades. So he has the key of Hades. So I'm asking myself, what should you do with the word Hades? In editions of the Greek Testament, the editors usually place this the footnote. I propose that you place them both in text side by side, as does Derrida himself. And I will read from Vitalis' book. It was the very introduction to Derrida's own text. What did I do in announcing this seminar under the title La vie, l'amour? That is replacing with a hyphen or without a spacing, without rate, with a marked silence. The and that usually was death with life, as juxtaposed or more properly opposed to life. So in this seminar, life, death, he wrote it without and without a hyphen. That's also my proposal. So you don't see and here or a hyphen. In order to pay homage to Derrida, partially, but also to this problem that you have a variant reading. This would also help to bring forth the questions, the issues that Derrida brings to light in his text. That death is hardest, it means invisible. But both Derrida and Heidegger point out that death is not invisible, that we should have an attitude of care towards death from the moment that we live. So there is always a trace of death in life, or as Heidegger would say that the more death that is present, the more authentically you live. If you think you will die tomorrow, you will live more authentically. That was Heidegger's point. And we also need to think about the genetic variation. Life is not a copy machine. And that will perhaps highlight that. Let's use that position. Do you want to add? Do you have any good ideas?
Yes, there's a lot of things coming to place, and I'm glad the order we made it in. This is a tough nut to crack, but with help, as we learned earlier from Edward de Bono and Heidegger, of course, who also wants to get away from the idea that oppositions, bare knowledge, can carry understanding. Is aletheia theia is showing that in between the two, the processing, what you can call the life process, comes to fore, not in opposition to anything. We also have a helper in Terry Mox Tarlow, shows that oppositions don't exist in nature. It is two fractal edges, like the coast of Norway, where nothing is opposing anything. And the important happening is in between. That will be absolutely blocked out by this view. We will lose out on the presencing on the force, the knowledge. All the knowledge is in between the sides of fractality. Nothing will remain if we only look at the sides. It's in this vitalist, so to speak, I use the word, but I would say energia, or life force in between us, which Heidegger calls presencing, or being, with a big B. This is the true foundational, and all this is derived from this, often unlawful. I say thank you very much, and until next time, have a good time. Bye bye.
Thank you.